Miss O'Kaylee back with another First Chapter Friday. For this First Chapter Friday, I chose Harris and Me by Gary Paulson, which is a funny book. I think it's funny from page 1 all the way until the end of the book. I really love it. Gary Paulson is an author you've probably heard of before. He wrote Hatchet, he wrote Brian's Song. He's written countless novels, so there's definitely probably something of his that you've read or you've seen, but Harris and Me is my all-time favorite Gary Paulson book. He writes about a little boy and Harris, who is the little boy's cousin. And the little boy gets moved around from different family members and foster homes and things because his parents are alcoholics. So he gets taken from them and sent around. And this story centers on a summer that he spends with Harris out on the farm that Harris grows up in, and they just straight up have adventures and mostly get into trouble and mischief and like ruin things and wreck things, and it's just really funny. If you want like a straight up boy adventure, this is a really good one, and it's really funny. So I'm going to read chapter 1 to you, see if it sucks you in, and if it does, find it, read it. It's a good one. Chapter 1, in which I meet Harris and am exposed for the first time to the vagaries of inflation. Meeting Harris would never have happened were it not for liberal quantities of Schiltz and 4 Roses. For nearly all of my remembered childhood, there was an open bottle of Schiltz on a table. My parents drank 4 Roses professionally from jelly jars, neat, without diluting ice, water, or mix. They were consequently vegetables most of the time, although the term vegetable connotes a feeling of calm that did not exist. They went through 3 phases of drunkenness: buzzed, happy, drunk, mean as snakes, and finally obliterated, 4 Roses coma. Unfortunately, the buzzed or happy stage only lasted a short time, and it grew shorter as time progressed until they were pretty much mean whenever they were conscious. Home became finally something of an impossibility for me, and I would go to stay with relatives for extended periods of time. By the time I was 11, I had stayed with several uncles, my grandmother, and an old Norwegian bachelor farmer who thought God lived in the haymow of our barn, where he was afraid to go without wearing a feed sack over his head. He told me, God couldn't see through feed sacks, and if God couldn't see you, you never died. I had many uncles and shirt-tail relatives, and when I was 11, a kind of rotation dumped me with Harris and his family. The sheriff sent a deputy to pick me up, and we left for the Larsons' place in late afternoon. They lived on a farm 40 miles north of the town I lived in, yet it might as well have been on a different planet. The ride took about an hour and a half, but it went through such varied terrain that before we had gone 5 miles, I was in despair. For 2 or 3 of those miles, the car moved past farm country that still seemed rather settled. Frequently, there were tractors working in the fields and people who waved cheerfully walking down the sides of the road. But soon the trees closed in closer and thicker until they were a wall on either side, and the road and car were enveloped in a curtain of green darkness. And there were no more open fields or driveways, just dirt tracks that disappeared into the forest and brush. It was like going off the edge of the earth on those old maps used by early explorers into places where it said, "There be monsters here." The deputy I was with spit continuously out the side window while extolling the virtues of the car, a 1949 Ford. "It's got the V8, he told me. Gets you a lot of power, the V8. Spit. You need power for catching criminals while a hot pursuit. Spit. You want to be able to move this thing when you go into a hot pursuit situation. Spit. There was absolutely no break in the forest. Black, green, densely vegetated, the summer northern woods fought right to the shoulder of the asphalt. Indeed, in places the trees came over the road and made a green tunnel. I kept looking for an indication of life. "People live here?" I finally asked. "Sure. Spit. Must be 200-300 of them scattered around, back in a ways." The road grew more narrow, closed in until it nearly disappeared ahead of the car, and just when it seemed the car would have to dive into the trees, the deputy hung a left and the car bounced as we turned onto a dirt road, or more accurately, a set of ruts. We drove on this track for some miles, probably 7 or 8, and again, just as the car seemed to run out of road, the deputy turned left once more. The tracks were still more narrow, and I thought we would surely get stuck in the ruts, but suddenly we exploded out into a large area of cleared land. "The Larson place," the deputy said. The cleared land must have been more than half a square mile. It was planted in corn and small grain and looked rich and even. Along one side of the rectangular field lay a half-mile long driveway straight along the edge, and we now turned down it. By this time, I was nervous and had trouble sitting still. I had met the Larsons only once, though they were in some distant way related to me, and that had been 4 years earlier when I was just 7. I had lived considerably since then, including almost 3 years in the Philippines, where my father had been stationed, and I had almost no memory of how they looked, what they were like. There were 4 of them, I knew that. Newt, some kind of second uncle, his wife, and my second aunt by marriage, Claire, their daughter Glennis, who was 14, and my second cousin Harris, who was 9. I thought of what to do as we moved down the drive. I had done this many times, been put in new places, and I had devised a method that worked. I pretended to be shy. Actually, it was only partly pretending, since I had a caution of meeting new people that often translated as flight. But shyness had served me well, and as we approached the house and farm buildings, I began to withdraw. They must have been expecting us, because as the deputy worked the 4 down the driveway and we bounced into the yard, they were all standing there waiting, one next to the other, where the driveway turned and widened next to the house. The deputy lifted his weight out of the car, holding onto the top of the car door and grunting, and motioned for me to get out the side door. I held back, the shyness kicking in, but in a moment realized that I would appear ridiculous if I stayed in the car, and so got out but stood by the door waiting. "Well, here he is," the deputy said. "I think we might be a bit early." His voice was fishing, ending in a half-question, which didn't make any sense until my Aunt Claire smiled, wiping her hands on her apron, an act I found later she did when worrying or thinking, and said, "Don't worry, Orlo. I made rhubarb pie and it's done. You aren't that early." The deputy smiled, nodded, and turned back to me and the car. "Don't hold back that way. Fetch your box and come on." I still didn't move, but Glennis Harris's sister, who was cloddish and smiled with her whole face, came forward and took my box out of the back seat of the car and started for the house with it. It was meant in a helpful way, but posed a problem because I had my private stuff in the box. Even that wouldn't have been bad, except part of my private stuff was a collection of art photographs that I had bought from a 70 centavos in the Philippines from a man on the street in Manila. In higher circles, the pictures would be known as artistic anatomical studies, but the man who sold them to me called them dirty pictures, which seemed far more accurate. I enjoyed looking at them, being a student of art and at an age when the hormones seemed to dominate my every waking moment, but was fairly certain neither Glennis nor her mother would approve of them. This nervousness was compounded by the fact that the deputy was still there, and I had somehow picked up the idea that the pictures were illegal. A mental image of me being arrested in front of all of them for possessing dirty pictures overcame my shyness, and I jumped forward and grabbed the box from Glennis. All this time, Harris had been standing, watching, his hands behind him. I hadn't really looked at him, but when I moved to take the box from Glennis, the grown-ups fell in together and started walking toward the house, and Harris came up alongside me just as I grabbed the box. Physically, he was of a set piece with Glennis, blonde hair bleached white by the sun, face perpetually sunburned and red with a peeling nose, freckles sprinkled like brown pepper over everything, and even white teeth, except that when Harris smiled, there were 2 gone from the front. He was wearing a set of patched bib overalls, no shirt, no shoes, just freckles in the bibs, which were so large he seemed to move inside of them. "Hi!" He walked beside me, his hands still to his rear. I would subsequently find that this posture could be dangerous, meant he was hiding something, but I didn't know that this soon, so I nodded. "Hi." We heard your folks was puke drunks, is that right?" "Harris," Glennis was walking on the other side of me, and her voice snapped. "That's not polite to talk that way." "Well, you can just blow it out your butt, you old cow. You ain't no grown-up to tell me what to do. How the heck am I supposed to know things if I don't go ahead and ask 'em?" Glennis was a strapping girl, and she reached across my back and slapped Harris on the side of the head so hard his teeth rattled. "You watch your tongue with all that swear, and I'll tell the folks and Pa will take a board to you." But Harris ignored her. I would find later that getting hit hard by Glennis was a regular part of his life, and asked again, "Well, are they?" I nodded. "They drink too much." "Do they see stuff?" "What do you mean?" "I mean like old Newtson in town. He's always drunk as peas his pants, and he's all the time talking about seeing Jesus in a peach tree." He snorted. "Heck, there ain't a peach tree closer than 1,000 miles to here. How can he see Jesus, even if Jesus was dumb enough to stand up in a peach tree? But like that, do your folks see things?" I shook my head. "They just fight, and then they puke." "Well, that's nothing. I puke all the time. Once I got the mad crop, and I puked green for 3-4 days. Just as green as grass." We had been walking all this time and had reached the porch. The house was old and needed paint, but was clean and looked somehow well cared for, comfortable. There were antlers nailed to the wall under the porch roof, and an old shotgun rested in them, and rubber boots were lined up near the front door. Glennis opened the door. Straight in, then up the stairs. I moved through the door into a small hallway with stairs at the end, and I climbed them to an unfinished upper floor that had been divided into two large rooms by a wooden wall. Outside, it was beginning to become evening and dark, and inside, it was hard to see anything at all. There didn't seem to be any electricity. I sleep out here, Glennis said, waving a hand at the room at the head of the stairs. You're in with Harris. She opened the door, and I carried the box through into the second room. There was a dormer window to let in some light, but it was still dim and seemed raw. The rafters were exposed 2x4s, and the boards of the roof showed, as did the points of the nails that held the shingles. The floor was rough wood, nailed with framing nails. The dormer window was in the middle, and on either side there was a small iron bunk. On each bunk there was a mattress and pillow and quilt done in patchwork colors that didn't seem to make any sense, or pattern, one color next to another. Yours is on the left, Harris motioned with his chin. I'm on the right for now. For now, I go back and forth. You switch bunks only when I need to. Need to? He studied me, his hand still behind his back. Then he shook his head. You don't know sheep crap from apple butter, do you? It's my guts. Kids' guts are like sheep guts. If a sheep sleeps on one side too long, all the guts swoosh over and stay there, and it can't get up without it falls over. I always sleep facing the window in case there's a fire, and so when I feel my guts get to squooshing over, I switch bunks and sleep on the other side, see? I put my box on the left bunk and sat. I guess so. Just tell me when we change. The mattress rustled when I sat on it, and I poked it with my hand. It makes a funny sound. It's dried corn shucks. These are from last year and getting old, so they don't stink anymore. You ought to hear it when they're new. It's so loud you can't sleep. There was the sound of an engine, and I watched out the window as the deputy backed the car out of the yard and drove off down the driveway. In spite of having done this many times, I felt suddenly lost, alone, and leaned forward to watch the car leave. Here. Harris had moved closer to me and was holding something out in his hand. I turned from the window and looked closely. It seemed to be a green, somewhat slimy ball with legs and eyes. What is it? It's a frog. He put it in my hand, and I could feel that it was still alive, the legs moving. What happened to it? I shoved a straw up its butt and blew it up. Why? So it can't dive? You put them in the stock tank over by the barn, and they float around on top of the water and can't get down, he smiled. Later I'll show you how to do it. You gotta watch you don't blow too hard or they'll pop on you. I did it once, and it took half an hour to get frog guts out of my hair. I put the frog on the sill of the dormer window where it rolled gently, its little front legs waving, and the deputy's taillights disappeared down the driveway. Frogs being blown up is not even the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the adventures that these two are going to have over the course of the summer of Harris and me. So I hope that you find this book, I hope that you read it, and I hope that you comment below and tell me what you think about it, because it's an awesome one and it's a funny one, and I hope you love it.